Hi, everyone. This is Chris Thornberg. I'm the founding partner of Beacon Economics, and I'll be on Dov Barron's show again. This week, we're going to talk about the Great Virus Lockdown, what it does or does not mean for the economy once we get out of this particular mess. I'll tell you my view of things, probably not as bad as you're hearing.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Barron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Barron, is the founder of FullMontyLeadership.com. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Barron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Barron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. I'm your host, Dov Barron, the Dragonist, and I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. To find out more, simply go to dovbarron.com. This episode of Leadership and Loyalty is brought to you in part by Magcast. Imagine having your own industry magazine. What would that do for your authority? Whether you're a coach, a content expert, or an emerging brand, it's hard to stand out from the crowd. So what if there was a proven way to increase both your perceived authority and your professional status in the eyes of your market, and to do it all at once? This is your way to go from being invisible to getting meetings with anyone. Find out more by going to magcast.co. That's magcast.co, where first-time publishers create thriving magazine businesses. All right, it has been said that the sign that we are doing well is by the amount of money we spend on travel. British Airways, as we're recording this, British Airways just laid off 12,000 people. Canada laid off 16,500 people. United has reduced its April schedule by more than 60%. Morgan Stanley economists expect a gross domestic product to plummet 30.1% in April and June quarter, with an unemployment rise of an average of 12.8 over that period, higher than at any point since the Great Recession. So what do you think the impact will be, the economic impact will be from the global pandemic? Well, stay tuned, because we've got a fascinating show for you where we're going to really look at that. Now, remember, you can chat about this episode or any past episodes inside of our Facebook and LinkedIn groups. Simply look for the Leadership and Loyalty Podcast. If you're a new listener and new viewer, I want to thank you for joining us. Strap yourself in. We're about to go full Monty. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you tune into podcasts. And remember, we always need your help in staying relevant. So please get over there, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And with an average of 2.5 to 4 million listeners for every single show, we're honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. In fact, if you are a podcaster or you want to be one, come and join us in our community at Podcast Delight. That's also on Facebook. Again, I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. All right, strap yourself in. We're about to go full Monty and dive right in. Were you prepared for the economic change before it happened? When your city, your country, the world went into some version of lockdown, 98% of the world just stopped making money. The stats have shown that the average American had about $400 for emergency. The average entrepreneur was an all-in entrepreneur, meaning they just kept putting money back into their business. So when the pandemic hit, it came like a tsunami for so many people. So the question is, can we recover? And if so, how long will it take? A year? 5 years? A decade? A month? Or, as people like Ray Dalio says, capitalism will never be the same. Let's find out together. On this episode, our guest is Dr. Chris Thornberg. He's been a guest on here before, and this is a very appropriate time to bring him back. He is the founding partner of Beacon Economics. He's also the director and adjunct professor at UC Riverside School of Business Center for Economic Forecasting and Development. Back before it happened, he also famously predicted the 2008 global recession. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me welcome a rather radical economist, Mr. Chris Thornberg.
Hey,
And he's
If only people got that excited about economics, but I appreciate the enthusiasm.
Oh, you?
Back.
Should we send that cheer over? So every time you enter the room?
Yeah. Well, although, we do have a bit of a following. There's no doubt about it. And while I don't intentionally try to be an iconoclast, I just necessarily find myself to be in the position of being contrarian time after time. We did make that call back in the day. We called the Great Recession. And it's funny, I mean, I love that rhetoric you led this in with, right? The conversation, what happens next? And capitalism will never be the same. The economy is going to take years to recover. This is worse than the Great Recession. All right, here's my prediction. You know how fast we get over this?
Go there. I want to get to your prediction, but before you want to get, I want your opinion on this, because I don't know what your opinion on Ray Dalio is, but he's a pretty well thought out guy. People tend to follow him. A lot of big people tend to follow him. He's a billionaire hedge fund manager and a futurist. Yeah. And during a Business Insider interview recently, he said, "The American dream does not exist right now," he says. Right now, it doesn't exist right now. And for leaders, leaders don't act, the whole economic system will collapse.
Yeah, fine. That's complete, utter nonsense.
Okay, good. Tell us.
And it is absolutely, completely universal across hedge fund managers. They're all screaming the same thing. And that's because it's not economic forecasting, it's strategic positioning. Hedge fund managers have managed to convince the world in the last 20 years that they really are the most important people in the room. And what that means was that everything's going great, no one should complain when they're raking in the billions and billions of dollars in profits. Mm-hmm. But when things go bad, you better be willing to pony up billions and billions of dollars of aid for the industry. That's not capitalism, my friend. That is called being a parasite on the economy. And the hedge fund managers have truly managed to work their way in to this wonderful world where you get it going up and you get it going down. Mm-hmm. Nice job if you can get it.
Right.
Putting all that to one side. The last time I was here and we talked, my theme was miserableism.
Yes.
The term, of course, is used to describe the current national atmosphere where everybody talks negative about everything, no matter what, right? And what I said is, look, if you strip away that stuff, if you pull through it, actually look at what's going on, consider what's happening out there today, the idea that we live in these difficult times, look, that collapses like a wet paper bag. Look, not even some of the dismal statistics you put up front. Majority of Americans can't scrape together $400 for an emergency situation. Mm-hmm. That quote unquote statistic has been debunked in more ways than I can possibly tell you. It is a garbage number. Every economist who understands the data understands it's a garbage number. It's not true. People have vastly more resources available to them than that. And yet, to your point, you quoted up front. Why? Because it is now conventional wisdom.
Right.
It fits not within economic realities, but it fits within this miserablest world where we have to make everything sound worse than it is. Now, I'm not for a second pretending this virus and the public health mandates that have locked down the economy in their wake aren't serious. This is by far and away the worst thing to hit our economy in 10 years. This will end up being called the recession. We know that now because Q1 came in, it was negative 4.8%, at least that's the initial estimate. Q2 is going to be negative 2%, so they're going to call this officially a recession.
Right.
But this isn't the Great Recession. It's nowhere near to a Great Recession type scenario. No matter how scary the numbers are, this is functionally temporary. And you said, how long? 3-4 months.
Okay, so let's address some of these things, right? So because, what you're saying there is pretty radical from what is being touted, okay?
Yeah, but again, let me just stop right there. Look, when it comes to any conversation about the economy, hysteria is the new normal, okay? Yep. In January of 2019, 75% of the economists who contribute to the Wall Street Journal Next Recession Survey said we were going to have a recession by 2020. Why? Well, because real estate was collapsing, inflation was heating up, interest rates were on the rise, and the Chinese trade war was about to demolish American manufacturing. By the way, none of that happened in 2019. It was a perfectly good growth year. And of course, by February of this year, believe it or not, only 10% of those economists thought we were going to have a recession in 2020. Hysteria is the new normal. Everybody always takes the most dramatic, negative turn, twist you can, and this is no exception. This is the biggest hit in a decade, and the only thing that's happened is the insanity, the hyperbolic, over-the-top nonsense that's inflicted our headlines has simply increased proportionately.
Well, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I said back in 2009, if I wondered, and I'll just put this to you, I said, if CNN, MSNBC, Fox, if nobody had come out and said there's a recession, I wonder what, I remember saying, I wonder what would have happened. I wonder if people would have just continued on as normal.
No.
Right. But I'm saying because we are fed by the media and we respond to the media response.
But again,
that's a piece.
There's never been a media-driven recession, okay? For all the conversations about consumer confidence and negative headlines, the most important bit of consumer confidence is basically what's in your checking account and that pay packet you just got, okay?
Right.
And that's what drives people, not the headlines. And let's talk about the Great Recession, because I'm glad you brought that up. Let's talk a little bit about that versus this, right? Let's think about, let's break it down. Now, to be clear, let me back up 2 seconds, or 2 steps, or the case may be. Look, when you think about where we are, we have to all start this conversation with a lot of humility, okay? Mm-hmm. That is to say, we don't have a lot of data yet. Yeah, okay, we have a Q1 GDP growth number.
Right.
But remember, this really only was a function of the last couple of weeks of the quarter, right? So it doesn't really tell us a lot. Mm-hmm. We have almost no data whatsoever on April right now because it's too early. We have to get to the end of April before we start thinking about April, right? So we don't know what's happening. We have lots of anecdotes, but very, very, very few actual data points, okay? Now, I say that because anybody who's a good forecaster is immediately going to say, I don't have any historic episode to base this on. This is a business cycle unlike anything we've dealt with in the last 40 years. Our models don't apply. We don't have data. And so anything we talk about has to be talked about with this idea that we don't have a clear path forward. Now, all these people screaming into the world are not actually offering that humility. Listen, this can get ugly. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Mm-hmm. But the idea that it's going to get ugly, that this is going to be worse than the Great Recession, there's not a shred of evidence of that. None. Okay. And it's amazing because all these people who are saying these negative things are doing so without ever once stopping and saying, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't have a clue what I'm talking about. I'm just making it up as I go along. Now, we don't do that. Look, I really try very hard to say, look, let's let the data talk to us. Let's let logic talk to us. Let's acknowledge the fact that we are in this unknown zone. And then let's start just thinking through what's going on out there and asking yourselves logically, does this in fact look like a Great Recession type scenario? Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk about the Great Recession. What happened then? Well, the Great Recession was created not in December of 2007 when it began, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, it was created in the previous 6 years. Yep. Between 2001 and 2007, we had the subprime revolution, right? Where Wall Street developed a wonderful way of funneling trillions of dollars into the US economy with no underwriting, right? Just incredible. One of the greatest financial frauds in the history of the United States, history of the world, will never be recreated. These guys figured out the greatest Ponzi scheme in the history of Ponzi schemes.
Yeah.
Now you wonder why I don't like hedge funds all that much, but putting all this one side.
Sure.
What are you dealing with here then? $15 trillion of subprime credit got pumped into the economy. Half of that went into households directly. The other half, by the way, was tied up in the financial system itself because they were doing all these asset-backed securities nonsense. $15 trillion that in turn overheated parts of the economy in a phenomenal way.
Mhm.
Obviously, there was a consumer lending industry. There was, of course, the housing industry, which saw a vast oversupply, new homes coming online, increase in prices like we've never seen, all this new debt driving it to frenzy. And then, of course, there was also the consumer imbalance because people took all that free money and home appreciation to heart. And they said, oh, I don't have to save anymore. Well, saving is something my parents did. That's passe. And you saw savings rates drop as consumer spending went through the roof, and the U.S. began to open up a massive trade deficit. In 2006, this economy was rotten to the core, no matter how good GDP was at the surface. Now, everything started falling apart in really mid-06. That's when the subprime numbers started turning off and borrowing started slowing down. The housing market started slowing down, and you could see it. It was like an iceberg coming at you. You weren't stopping it. Bam, it hit. Everything fell apart. 6-quarter downturn, almost 6% real GDP decline. And it wasn't just the short run. It took years for the economy to get back to normal levels of output. It was the biggest hit to our economy in decades. It was nasty. Now, let's compare that to today. Do we have a massive subprime bubble? No. Do we have any economic problems at all prior to the pandemic? No.
Oh, we do have a deficit.
People getting laid off. Well, hang on.
We did have a pretty huge deficit.
Well, yes, we had a big public deficit.
Yes.
That's true. That's true. That was one thing, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
But clearly the economy's fine, right? I mean, look at all the Wall Street Journal pessimists had backed off their numbers, and everybody said it was going to be a good year, and suddenly this pandemic shows up. Now, what's got everybody freaked out is, of course, initial claims for unemployment.
Yep.
Initial claims for unemployment. The entire year of 2008, there were 22 million claims. In the last 5 weeks, almost 30 million. Okay. You look at that and you go, Thornberg's a nut. This is crazy. This is much worse than the Great Recession. No, because back then.
Lagging indicator.
Yeah, it was a lagging indicator. It was driven by the collapse of the bubble. Look, millions of people in finance, in real estate, in construction, in retail. Back then, these people lost their jobs, and they lost their jobs permanently. Permanently. Those people had no idea what they're going to do next. It took them years to rebuild their finances, their incomes, their careers. Years. And it was an enormous hit to the economy.
Right.
This time around, there's nothing driving these permits, these applications for unemployment, except for the fact that we have public health mandates that prevent people from going to work.
Well, that's not entirely true, Chris, because as I just said, you've got airlines that have laid people off. And I just used one example, which was airlines. We also know that one of the top 5 industries for employment is hospitality, and they've laid everybody off. And so if you're laid off from work,
right,
and you've already started to fall behind,
right,
then how are you going to go out and spend money?
But see, you made assumptions in there. You see, you're missing.
Okay, what are the assumptions?
Well, right after that, you said you were already falling behind. Where did you come up with that?
Because I already know people who are falling behind.
You may know people, but just because you know people doesn't mean it's a statistic.
Okay, that's fair.
I know people who are rich. It doesn't mean we're all rich. So let's go ahead.
That's fair, but are you telling me this? Hold on. So you're telling me the statistics are that are not showing that people are falling, the middle class are struggling right now?
No, they're not.
They're not. Okay.
Listen, Dub, work with me here, man. Listen, let me talk for a second, okay?
Yep.
I understand, but you're confusing two different things here, okay?
Very good.
Let's say, for the sake of argument, that but 2 weeks after the public health mandate, some genius came up with a cure for the virus, okay? Bam, you admit that within days, the public health mandates would have been lifted and everyone went back to work, right?
To a degree.
Okay, why wouldn't they?
Well, for one simple reason.
Right, and I said 2 weeks after this began.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example, right? So the example is the mandate says you can go back, but restaurants are only allowed, and they already talked about this.
No. I said if we had a cure and the mandates were purely lifted. This is just a hypothetical. I'm just setting up an experiment.
So it doesn't exist anymore in any form.
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, if there's
everyone will go back to work, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we all know that the numbers we're seeing right now are driven by nothing more than the public health mandates. And the damage to the economy is nothing more than, well, whenever the mandates go away, some level, right? Because, you know, again, if a business was profitable before the mandate, there's no reason to think the business wouldn't be profitable after the mandate. If you had a good job before the mandate, there's no reason you couldn't have a good job with that business after the mandate. Nothing changed, okay? So in theory, the pre and the post-mandate economy are exactly the same. Now, your point is, and you're right here, this is where the rubber hits the road. The point here is very simple. The damage to the economy that will prevent a very rapid rebound is damage to the economy being created during the lockdown. Workers aren't getting work. Businesses aren't able to receive revenue. And as that goes on, workers can't get work, you can't get their paycheck, and these businesses can't get revenues. Then the damage starts to build. And depending on how much damage builds during the mandate, that will in turn determine how rapid of a rebound there is in the back end.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Yep.
That's the key here. That's the question. You can't look at any of the numbers we're seeing right now because all these numbers are only as sustained as the mandates, period. But what kind of damage will get done, and what does that mean for the bounce back afterwards? That's the question. Now that boils down to 5 questions.
Okay.
And this is how we think about it. 5 questions are: how deep are the downturn? How long is the downturn? I'm sorry, back up. How deep are the mandates? How long is the mandate? How healthy was the economy to begin with? What is the government doing in the meantime? And will people's behavior change in any permanent way post-pandemic? Now, this is how we thought about this, as opposed to running models which aren't really in any way, shape, or form viable because the economy isn't behaving in any normal way. We broke this down into these 5 questions, and it's pretty clear that when you go through these 5 questions and answer those questions, what you find is not something I suggest to you with this long, painful recovery, but rather a very, very sharp V. Let's go through them real quick. How deep? How deep are things actually happening? Well, listen, I appreciate your numbers on restaurants, hotels, and airlines. You're absolutely right. Did you know if you took all restaurants, all hotels, and all airlines and added them up, their contribution to GDP is half of healthcare by itself?
Mm-hmm.
They're a tiny fraction of the economy. Yes, they're very visible. Seeing an empty airport is kind of weird, but it's not a big part of the economy. And this doesn't get into the rest of the economy until you start to see supply chains hits, which take months to build up. It doesn't happen overnight. These things cascade.
Right.
And remember, even in the midst of those kind of situations, a lot of restaurants are figuring out how to serve you at home. And they're actually doing, and they're not making money, but they're keeping people working. They're keeping revenue going through. You give little signs. Hotels are actually busier than you think because there are still people having to do essential travel. It's nothing like it was. If you were a tourist hotel, you're empty. But if you're a business hotel, you'd be surprised. Things are happening. And yeah, I know those airlines are cutting way back. But then again, they did that after September 11th too. This is kind of standard for the industry. They take big hits and then they bounce back. Mm-hmm. Nothing there scares me. Nothing in terms of those data. Our analysis suggests overall the economy, probably about 10% of economic activity is being constrained. Now that's going to grow because of supply chain effects, but 10% is not all that much. And by the way, that means really only about 10 or 12% of overall incomes are being affected. Now, number 2, how long does this go? Well, again, we already have some light there. The answer is this is done by the end of this quarter. We know that from watching Italy and Spain and China. We know that because the number of new cases has already peaked and starting to come down, because we have systems in place, because it's summer, all sorts of reasons that we're already on the back end of this thing. Now, I know things don't get fixed immediately, and this virus isn't disappearing. It's not going to turn into a smallpox and never be seen again, but we're much smarter now. I tell everybody, you're not going to have a second round the way we did this time. Why? Because people were dying of this virus in February when our president was running around saying there was no virus in our country. Okay? You only get one Pearl Harbor. Ask the Japanese. They'll explain it to you. You get one shot. That's it. If it doesn't pan out, you don't get a second try. They had their Pearl Harbor. Now we're going to have SWAT teams of public health professionals looking, searching, constantly scouring, making sure this doesn't happen again. So
okay. I've got two things I want to come back at you with, and
okay.
I want to.
But let's go through the questions quick, if you don't mind. I know you're.
Go ahead then. Okay,
I
yeah.
realize I'm talking a lot here.
No, that's
I'm,
okay.
I'm a talkative guy, as the case may be. I appreciate your space. Okay, let's go through 3, 4, and 5. 3, how healthy is the economy? Well, I had this conversation with you last time.
Yeah.
The idea that most Americans for $400, nonsense. Complete, total, utter nonsense. In fact, if you look at data from the Survey of Consumer Finances, which comes from the Federal Reserve, best data we have, not only are debt burdens on American households lower today than they were in 2007, they're lower than they were in 1998. Well, that's for high-income families, Chris. No, actually not. They break that data down on quintiles of households. And whether you're the bottom 20% or the top 10%, your debt burden today is substantially lower than it was back then. People aren't carrying a lot of debt. Housing, as a percent of people's income, housing costs, cheapest it's been in a decade. When we came into this, remember, for the last 2.5 years, the biggest problem in the US economy, labor shortages. For 2.5 years, we've had more job openings than people looking for work. Wages have been rising at a nice, decent basis. You look at the debt markets. Debt markets were incredibly clean. I heard Moody's claim that 15% of homeowners were going to get foreclosed on. Worse than the Great Recession. Why? This is the cleanest housing market we've seen in 30 years. Because of Dodd-Frank, there's been very low borrowing. Equity levels in American real estate are all-time high levels. There's no sign of oversupply. Mortgage, the median borrower in mortgages has been above 750 for a decade. This is a rock-solid housing market. It's not going to go down.
Right.
I can go through a litany of these things. The economy was in solid shape when this thing hit. And you know, some people are going to get released. They're going to get released in, again, one of the tightest labor markets we've ever seen. Not a problem. Number 4, what's the government doing? I got a better question. What the hell aren't they doing? This is crazy. And you know, you talk about the difference between this happening.
Are you talking about the stimulus package? Is that what you mean?
Oh my God, the stimulus package. Off the charts.
Right.
2.5 trillion plus in spending. Now, keep in mind, you know, in the run-up to the election prior to the Great Recession, or during the Great Recession, people were arguing whether or not we had a recession. And then when the stock market finally cratered in September in the run-up to the election, finally, Congress was like, oh, maybe we do have a problem here. And they did some half measures. And then Obama came into power, and Mitch McConnell's primary goal was to make sure Obama was a one-term president, not to help the economy. So they did very little. They did it very late. They didn't help. This time around, complete opposite. 2.5 trillion plus in spending. Now, again, context. This is a $22 trillion economy. In each quarter, we see about $5.5 trillion of economic transactions. They're doing $2.5 trillion in stimulus in a $5.5 trillion quarter.
So that's almost 50%.
It's incredible. I've never seen anything like it. You know, candidly, a lot of this isn't even helping the economy. They're trying to buy the election. $1,200 every American, doesn't matter when they were hurt. Ridiculous. Small business loans for every business. Huh? It's crazy. They're throwing money away. So, but again, huge. Last but not least. Okay, so what we got here? How long? How deep? Not that deep, not that long. Government doing crazy amounts. And last but not least, of course, healthy economy. So the only thing we have to think about is, will consumers be fundamentally different after this? And this, again, is something I just love, because what do the miserablest say? Oh my God, people are afraid. They're never going to go out. They're never going to go to a ball game. This is a new normal. No, this is a return to an old normal. Listen, people, pandemics have always been among us. Smallpox, diphtheria, mumps, tuberculosis, yellow fever, typhus, the plague. We've been dealing, as humanity has been dealing with these things for since we've been around. They have records of plagues ripping through Rome in 300 BC.
Yep.
This is nothing new. And guess what? For all these episodes in the past, there's never been any evidence that people stopped going out after. So maybe we are truly the fragile generation. Maybe we have declined so much in our personal strength that we really will change. I'd like to think we're maybe kind of half as tough as the Romans.
Right.
Now, again, there's nothing here that says to me people are going to permanently change. Yeah, we're going to be a little smarter. We're going to wash our hands a little more. Maybe we'll wear a mask. But then again, they've been doing that in Asia since, of course, they had SARS and MERS.
Yep.
And they're probably better off for it, and I'm sure we will too. But again, the idea that people are going to permanently change is just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It just doesn't.
Okay.
So again, you add it up. What do those things tell you? This is a V. These are not job losses. Everybody keeps going, job losses are terrible. Job losses. No, these are not job losses. These are temporary job layoffs. In the Great Recession, millions of people had no idea what they're going to do next. The vast majority of people who have been laid off today know exactly what they're going to do next. They're going to go back and do exactly what they were doing before this thing happened. It's not the same thing.
So let me be a little more
please
on the ground with this, because I want to, I mean, listen, Chris, couldn't be happier if you're absolutely right. Right. So I just want you to know that.
I'm not always, but usually.
But so this is not from any miserablest point of view. This is from like, okay, let's keep this grounded, because as we talked about, people are infused by the media, whether that's positive or negative, you know, it is what it is. Right. So I want to bring it back to sort of nuts and bolts for people who are, you know, looking at this right now.
Okay.
So, you know, you've got, the Business Insider said 110,000 restaurants are expected to permanently close. I know people I've met.
That's absolutely preposterous.
Okay, well, I know people I've met who, hold on, let me finish, who have been in business with restaurants for years and years, who have had to close their doors. On top of that, we know, because like as we record this, many parts of the world are already preparing to start opening up and come back a little bit, which is great.
And we're seeing,
but they're going to come back in the context of restaurants, saying 25% to 50% of capacity. Well, you can't run a profitable business at that, and the rent isn't 50% or 25%, so your expenditure is still going up, and that could. Let's just take that as one example.
Yeah, okay. Three things there. Let me respond to that quickly.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, you're right. Not every restaurant's going to reopen, but I'll tell you why. It's not because of the virus. It's because of the fact that the country was oversupplied with restaurants in the first place. It's an industry that is overexpanded. They have a capacity issue, and some won't reopen simply because we have too many. Period. Okay. But putting that little tidbit to one side, simply fast forwarding some of the excess that was already going to occur. The idea that 100,000 plus restaurants aren't going to reopen, why? If you were a successful restaurant that was making money in January and February, why would you not also be a successful restaurant in July and making money? What would prevent you from going back out and doing business? In fact, quite the opposite. What else would you do?
Well, if the government, as I said, you can't have more than 25 to 50% capacity, you can't run a profitable business.
Well, first of all, I don't think they're going to keep 25% capacity, maybe 50% for a couple extra months. But, you know, again, remember, you just deal with it. So you're going to extend your hours a little bit. You're going to have a little bit of a wait. People will eat a little earlier, a little later. It's not as if somehow or other that's going to kill a business. It just isn't. And something else to keep in mind. Look, they didn't make money for a couple of months. I appreciate that. What business makes money every single month? Any? Do you know why they used to call Black Friday Black Friday?
No, I don't.
Because that's when retail shops actually made a profit for the year. They lost money from January to the day after Thanksgiving. And it wasn't until the day after Thanksgiving they started making money.
Right.
Look, most restaurants couldn't care less until July or August anyway, because they're not busy this time of year. Now, you said, well, rents are going to continue to go up. No, they won't.
No,
Again,
I didn't say go up. I said they stay the same.
yeah,
If they stay the same and I'm at 25% capacity.
but landlords are getting into this too. It isn't just the federal government who's getting involved here. Landlords are also getting involved. Look, landlords aren't dumb. If you're a good paying restaurant, a good restaurant that's paid your rent on time, that's been a successful attractor to your particular shopping plaza, you're going to work to make sure that restaurant will maintain being open, because you'd prefer an active, healthy, successful restaurant to a hole in your shopping center. Everybody who owns commercial real estate knows this. So they will work with these restaurants. They will not impose such high fixed costs on them that they're going to push them out of business. It makes no sense. So again, none of this makes any sense. And besides, here's the other thing we got to keep in mind. Yet again, you're going to the most obvious indicator of the public health mandates, restaurants and bars.
Sure.
Restaurants and bars are not a big part of the economy. Big part of the labor force. But as far as GDP goes, they're pretty teeny tiny.
Yeah,
because
but when
it's
you talk
largely
about
a labor sector.
Well, that's what I was talking about before. When you talk about the labor force, you're also talking about people who have disposable income of any kind.
Yes.
So if I work in a restaurant and they've laid off because they can only be 25% capacity, I don't have a job, therefore I'm not spending. Therefore, I mean, there's a trickle effect and a run-on effect that just keeps going. That's what I'm talking about. That's why I'm using restaurants as an example of being sort of meat and potatoes. Somebody who works in a restaurant probably doesn't have a ton of savings. And if their job goes away, they're not going out to spend. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Sure, but you know, it's interesting. So we got the Q1 number in today, right? Mm-hmm. There's a couple of things that made me feel pretty good about this number. Well, yeah, it was a negative 4.8%. How can you feel good about that? But again, scratch away, look what's happening. First of all, yes, we saw the hit to autos. We saw the hit to restaurants and hotels. The travel stuff we saw in there very clearly was exactly what we anticipated.
Yeah.
Two things came out of that, though, that was very surprising. Almost half the decline in economic output in the first quarter of this year, believe it or not, came from one sector, which, by the way, is not cyclical. Healthcare. Sounds weird, but healthcare was an enormous negative in Q1. And that's because the healthcare sector simply said, anybody who's doing anything that's not necessary, you're not doing it now.
Right.
Dentist office closed down, eye doctors closed down. Well, guess what? This is not a cyclical industry. People are going to get their teeth cleaned. They're going to get their cavities filled. They're going to go in for that surgery they needed. They're going to do it in the second half of the year. So yeah, that was a big negative, but healthcare is not cyclical. There's no inventories. All that spending is going to go back into place at the end of the year. That's a big lift. Here's another thing. So to your point, there are certain workers out there, certain business people out there who are losing a lot of income. And of course, because they're losing income now, they're not going to be able to spend as much in the third quarter.
Exactly.
There's another group of people who are making money right now, which would include you and me, but we are being denied the ability to spend that money. Mm-hmm. So the question is where is the weight greater? The pent-up demand driven by people who can't spend money, or lost demand driven by people who can't earn any money right now? Well, again, we got some very interesting numbers from the first quarter of the year, because one of the things we saw was a surge in the savings rate. Clearly, pent-up demand is growing much faster than the loss in future demand. And indeed, if you look at the numbers, you can kind of back out. We won't get the other number until tomorrow, the next day. But I'm guessing the savings rate in March by itself was about 13.5%. To put that in context, the savings rate last year in Q4 was about 7.5%.
Right.
So you're talking an enormous surge in savings, and you know all that savings is going to come roaring out in terms of a surge in consumer spending in the third quarter of the year when people are allowed to spend again. And that's going to help all those people who have been displaced right now. Look, this is a recession. People and businesses are getting hurt. Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. And I'm not trying to diminish any of that. My point here is when you actually look what's happening, what you're going to see is a huge surge after this record negative second quarter. Things are going to come bouncing back. I've heard this as well. A conventional statistic, 70% of restaurants are not going to reopen. And again, what's the source of that? Nothing. There is no source. It's some clown out there trying to scare people. It's probably a Russian bot coming up with that nonsense. There's no reason to believe it. The vast majority of restaurants are going to reopen because there's demand for what they do, and the owner and the manager want to do it.
So what about when the Chamber of Commerce, their research showed that 1 in 4 small businesses are very likely to close, and they can't say, what's the thoughts on that?
Miserableism, nonsense.
Okay.
Hyperbolic headlines trying to get people's attention, screaming for my piece of the pie, as the case may be. This is all strategic positioning. It's not logical economic analysis.
So when you talked before,
let me back up a little bit, right? Here, the National Apartment Council, which is kind of like the organization that lobbies for apartment owners at the national level, they came out with an amazing headline. 30% of people didn't pay their rent on April 1st. Well, turns out that that's true on April 1st, but that's because most people pay April 2nd or 3rd. And oh, by the way, according to their statistics, most months, not even 80% of people pay on the 1st. Most of them pay by the 2nd or 3rd.
Right.
So right off the bat, they're spinning numbers that don't make a lot of sense. I've talked to some folks who manage apartments. They're not seeing anything close to those kind of numbers.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, most folks I know are like, yeah, no, I've already paid. It wasn't that big of a deal. A couple of people said they're paying late, but that's it. But nothing. Okay, so it's not really. But then I continue. I'm like, well, why are they saying that? Well, then it went in, and then they started talking about this. Well, you don't understand. If apartment owners don't get their rent, they can't maintain their apartments. And then this is the part I love the best. Where this is on like the news, and he says this out loud. You think the housing crisis is bad now? Think about when landlords start shutting down 50-unit buildings because they can't pay the expenses. What? and then they said, clearly Congress needs to pay people's rent. Oh, I see. This has nothing to do with reality. This is about you trying to get the government to take out another $500 million in loans and give it to apartment owners.
So what do you think? Just let's put this is connected, but not directly online, which is when there's the Andrew Yang talked about it, and it's become more popular now with this universal. Yeah. What's your thoughts on that?
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. It just makes life a lot easier. I think it's something we should do. But you would have to have such a phenomenal rebuilding of the U.S. fiscal system. It's not politically feasible, but it makes total sense.
Right.
So it just makes sense, yeah.
I want to bring up something here that we haven't addressed that I think is a concern. As I mentioned to you before when we last spoke, not recording, but just spoke, that I had conducted a 4-part interview with an advisor to the World Health Organization. And one of the things he said with absolute certainty is there will be a second wave.
Sure.
And what we know is that more people died in the second wave of the Spanish flu than they did in the first. That's true. The time is different, and
it's completely different.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Yeah. But there's still, there still were idiots who were not paying attention to the fact of the spread. Yeah. And he said very clearly the size of the second wave will be completely bent on how good we were at isolating in the first.
Right.
Have we been great? I'm not so sure about that. Yeah. But anyway, so let's say there's a second wave,
mm-hmm.
and let's say the second wave is half of what it was. We still got to shut down. We've still got to put people in isolation.
Yep.
And we go through this again.
Yep.
What's the recovery or the your sense of the recovery if we double dip into this shutting down the economy?
That's the W. Economists have been calling that the W scenario, where we bounce and then we go back up and then we up again.
Yeah.
Well, that's it. It would be a W, right? And yeah, every time it happens, you lose a little bit of long run on. It takes a little longer to recover. I still would argue we'd have a second V, maybe not quite as frenetic on the bounce back because the underlying economy won't be quite as healthy, given what we had to deal with in this time around. So on that front, again, listen, again, we have to approach this with utmost humility. And I realize I've been pretty forceful making my points because I do get frustrated with the constant negativity that just dominates these conversations. And it's like, no, listen, if you take a step back and really think about this, it doesn't make sense, this crazy negative things people are saying and so on and so forth. But again, I have to maintain the same humility that everybody else should be, which is to say, hey, you're right. Look, I don't think in its current form, this virus is going to come roaring back. I think we're going to be smarter about it. Remember, the Spanish flu was in some ways worse than this because it hit healthy people, not unhealthy people, the way this one does. And we still lived in the dark ages from a medical perspective. Mm-hmm. And remember, it was World War I and craziness was going on. And there's just all sorts of reasons to say that that's not an apt metaphor for what's going on now. What scares me, if you said, well, Chris, what scares you? What would scare me is not this virus coming back, but a mutated form of this virus coming back. Because that's always a problem with these things. They mutate, they change, right?
Well, it has already mutated in Australia.
And it has a little bit, right? It hasn't changed.
They've shown a second mutation of it in Australia already.
Well, there you go. And that's the kind of stuff that does scare me. And that's we have to start worrying about that. Again, I still think we bounce back, maybe not quite as frenetically. I still think I still get that second V there. But again, this damage starts to build. Every time this happens, it's a little bit more damage to the economy. But the other thing to think about there, and I think that people should take some heart in this, which is to say, while it is true this thing can mutate, it could come back. On the other side of it, as a society, given our health resources, given how smart we're being about things, one would also argue that, again, you'll get one Pearl Harbor. I'll say that again, right? That if it starts coming back, we're going to be a little quicker off the line, hopefully get this under control in a little quicker fashion before it gets out of control. And then if you really want to be hopeful, and of course, this goes towards some of the things we're sort of trying to figure out about right now, is you've seen these tests, right, where they go out and they look for antibodies. And we're actually finding a lot more people have been exposed to this thing than we realized.
Yes.
And it may well end up being that this thing isn't going to be able to get traction in the second round because too many people have already been exposed and have already built up immunity to it. That's, it could mutate and be much worse. We could have all most of us been exposed and it could never get off the ground. There's a huge range of outcomes there.
There is, including the fact that what we now know is you can get it more than once. And that the antibodies are not strong enough. And there's all kinds of other sides to it from a medical point of view. You talked about labor being a lagging indicator.
Almost always.
Right? And I understand that. So what would be a leading indicator for us to really be able to see?
But that's sort of my point, right? I've always said that employment is a lagging indicator. We point out, for example, initial claims for unemployment insurance actually peaked in July of 2009 after the recession was over.
Right.
What's weird about this one is, believe it or not, the initial claims for unemployment insurance are already falling. They're already going down.
As of when?
As of actually, the first 2 weeks were the worst, and actually the last 3 weeks have been going down, down, down. So we're at some level, we're already over the hump, as the case may be on that particular front. Because remember,
that's certainly not the information we're being fed.
No, you're not, because no one wants to talk about the fact that it's
getting bigger and will continue to get bigger.
Yeah, and then think of it this way. The way to think about this, and it's a great point, I'm glad you brought it up. The way to think about it is these initial claims for unemployment insurance are not a reflection of economic pain. They are a reflection, if you will, of just the mandates. But the mandates are now in place, and you're not going to see anything more extreme. And that means from here on out, maybe starting this week, next week, the week after, pay attention to those claims, because they start creeping up again. That's supply chain effects. That's true damage. So it's hard to say, it's hard to think about this way, but you got to think the last 5 weeks initial claims don't mean anything. The next 5 weeks for initial claims, those mean something.
Okay. So, all right. So
that's one thing to pay attention to.
Yeah. So for us who are not economists like you, Chris, what do we need to look for?
Right.
For us to go, it's okay, we're going to be all right, let's get back into it. Or, shit, hold on to your pennies.
Again, I would be paying attention to what's happening just in terms of the sheer number of cases. The public health information we have out there is probably the best we have at this point in time. And that is to say, as long as those number of cases continue to fall, and they are slowly getting over the peak, I think the future is pretty much set. And again, you want to look at those number of new cases. If that thing starts to come up again, if we start to get a second wave, because places like Georgia and Florida have opened up, you could have more pain coming down the pike. And again, remember, all the damage been done now is inherently temporary, but the damage being done in the meantime, that's permanent. And if we have a second wave, if number of new cases starts to rise again, and you start to see again whole economies having to shut down, more damage yet there. So the number of new cases, the number of claims for initial claims for unemployment insurance, those are important statistics. As long as they continue in the same direction, I'm not worried. If they start to turn the corner, I will start to worry.
Okay, so let me sort of veer it a little bit left here, because I want to look at this in a bigger picture sense. And what I mean by that is, everything that we're being thrown at it by the media right now is very immediate. And you're right. I mean, it's pretty terrifying to most people most of the time, because they don't have your understanding of it. And I totally get that. But looking at this further out, we both know, you probably know much better than I do, the push for global financial dominance of China, right? And how that has been pushed forward, and how they are buying mineral rights in Africa and building infrastructures. And they're doing a lot of things to make sure they become the next global financial empire.
Right.
And with that, the potential for the US dollar to stop being the globally traded finance, and also a rise of digital economies. There is also some prophecy, we'll call it, of a digital financial global currency. I'm not saying necessarily Bitcoin, but something similar that is more global.
Yeah.
Talk to me about, do you think that the pandemic thing and this impact, do you think it's going to move any of those things forward faster?
No,
going to slow it down, or it's going to make it no difference whatsoever?
Well, no, I think it will be a difference. But look, I think everybody was already having problems with China, right? Nobody trusts them. A lot of people are frustrated, and this isn't going to make that go away. In fact, this is going to intensify that. This started in China. It was way too hidden. Everybody's a little scared. The supply chain disruptions, you might have been hit because you're not there. If you were involved there, this is going to make everybody trust China a little less, and that means that's going to get pushed to one side. So no, I don't think it's going to rush those things along in any stretch of the imagination. I will say this, talking about financial markets in general. I have sort of made fun of the stock market and its excessive volatility it's exhibited over the last decade. Remember, go back to January of last year, where again, we were 20% down, and that was the sixth major sell-off in this expansion. And it's easy to laugh. Oh, they're hyper volatile, blah, blah, blah. This time around, financial markets spasmed so hard that it sent shockwaves into short-run lending markets. Mm-hmm. And that in turn necessitated the Federal Reserve to inject trillions of dollars into overnight markets to stabilize things.
Yes.
So let's take a step back, because now it's no longer funny. Now we have a real problem, because look, if my view of the world is right, that this thing's a relatively sharp V, then we took a punch in the face, but candidly a small one. And we're going to bounce back in the second half of the year pretty frenetically, and this is going to be behind us. And we're going to be fortunate, because this thing could have been a lot worse as far as bugs go. It could have been even deadlier or even easier to catch, and maybe this thing could have been much rather. So maybe this is a good public health lesson. But let's think about that for a second. The stock market, its collapse from the bubble it was at in January of this year, was so ferocious that it bled into other parts of the financial system and threatened to create a crisis that didn't need to exist in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Financial markets are supposed to be shock absorbers of the economy.
Right.
It's where we go to diversify, to make sure that if things go sideways, we're all going to be okay, right? Because that's the system that's in place. It's the trampoline at the bottom of the fall, right? Well, the geniuses who run our current financial system have managed to change it from a shock absorber and turn it into a shock accelerator.
Mm-hmm.
It's no longer about diversification. Finance today is candidly, it's a high-end poker table in Vegas, and the guys sitting around that table are all professionals just waiting for the mark to walk in so they could take advantage of the mark. By the way, we're the mark. John Q. Public, we're the marks. You know, at what point in time are we going to wake up to the fact that the markets aren't behaving properly? And the reason they aren't behaving properly is because they're not set up properly. That the incentives in these large financial institutions, in these markets, are designed to encourage them to take advantage of public, to rip us off, not protect us.
Right.
When are we going to realize that? When are
But even if we do, what are we going to do about
it?
Even if we do realize it, what are we going to do about it, Chris?
We got to re-regulate. We got to dive into those markets. We got to get rid of all these crazy, weird incentives.
Because, you know, like your labor market being a lagging indicator, many see the stock market as a leading indicator.
It's
right?
not an indicator of anything. It's, again, 7 major sell-offs in the last 10 years. 7.
Right.
We've never seen this. And we're talking going from a 20% sell-off last year. In 2019, we were at a 20% sell-off in January. By April, we are at record highs. By January, we had the 3rd highest PE ratio ever registered in the stock exchanges, behind only 1929 and 2000. This is not a normally behaving stock market. This is driven by high-speed trading, driven by dark pools.
Yeah.
We have to get in front of this. Markets have to be built to help people, not fleece people.
But again, somebody listening to this would say, how do we do it? What do we do?
Oh,
I mean, because we, you know, using your language, we are John Q. Public.
Yeah.
You know, we're not running the Senate, Congress.
Yeah.
You know, we're not the president.
Yeah,
you know, we're not the Fed. So,
huge
and the Fed's about as federal as Fed Express.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not anything to do with the public.
Right.
So aren't we sort of, excuse the language, you know? I mean, because we are bent over and they're the ones
I get it. I get it. But you know what? You know, that happens in a lot of places. You get entrenched special interests who warp the system to their own advantage. And eventually things get so bad that it has to change. And I'm hoping that maybe this is that example. We'll see. We'll see. You could be right. Maybe it's, you know, it's too hard for us to do anything about it.
That's what I'm asking you, Chris.
Yeah.
What has to happen? Because, you know, this is my concern. I think, you know, I just did a video on this and I put it out. Human beings are famously bad for not learning from their mistakes. Famously bad from not learning from history.
Yeah.
And you know, the stay-at-home order, you know, people hated it. They didn't like it. But you know what? I'm hearing people saying, you know, I'm talking to my family. I'm playing board games with my family. You know, I'm meeting with people that are relatives and we're having drinks over Zoom or whatever it is. And there's a connection. And, you know, and we know that loneliness was a crisis before. Yeah. And now we're locked down. We're actually less lonely. We're connecting more with people.
I believe that.
The problem is that now as we start to gear back to, quote, normal and open things up, we jump back onto the frickin' treadmill and start running it, going to the high, to the temple of hustle to make it happen again. Yeah. And then we end up in the same place and we don't learn. So this is what I'm asking you. What do you think? You're an economist. You're your finger on the pulse.
Well, no, I'm an economist, Dov. I look, you're asking me about human psychology. And
no, I'm not asking about human psychology. I'm asking you what has to happen economically for people to actually pay attention.
Yeah.
Because you just said the markets are fleecing people. It's a high stakes game in Vegas.
I hopefully people learn. I don't know what to tell you. I really don't. I have this conversation all the time. It's an unfortunate consequence of our world that we all have these short attention spans driven by just constant, hit. We never read more than 2 paragraphs in anything we read nowadays. I think that is a problem, and hopefully people will learn to take a step back and read a little more deeply. Maybe this is so preposterously over the top negative. Maybe this will get people to wake up to the fact that these headlines are just the needless scare stories. We'll see. Maybe this is the turning point. I just don't know. I hope so, because I get tired of this. I get tired of seeing the same grim, over the top, hyperbolic negative headlines. And then when you read in a little bit, you're like, this is just somebody making stuff up, and they're doing it to get attention, not because they're helping people navigate these difficult times.
Yeah, I mean, I was saying to somebody this week, we were having a conversation, and they're asking me about my knowledge and what I learn, and they said, but do you watch the news? And I said, I watch tons of news, but I don't watch a news. And they go, what do you mean? I listen to Al Jazeera, RT, as well as the BBC, as well as Fox and CNN and all those things. And one of the things I've noticed is the headline can be exactly the same, which is what people read. But the content is vastly different from one to another. Yeah. And so this is,
or vice versa. Sometimes the content's exactly the same, but the headline's completely different.
Yeah, because everybody's trying to spin, right?
Make some point, right?
Right. So the thing for me is that I do believe, and maybe I'm wrong, and I'm okay with that, but I do believe that we are at the brink of the fall of the American empire in the form that we know it. And maybe that's the universal income thing that changes, because capitalism has gone into cronyism, and we've gone a bit mad.
Well, listen, I think capitalism has always been fundamentally tied to cronyism. They say democracy is, what did Churchill say? Democracy is the worst form of government, but it's the only one we have.
Yeah.
You can go on and on. Look, we live in an imperfect system because human beings are imperfect.
That's true.
I guess as an economist, what I've learned is that nothing's ever perfect.
No.
But we can all, by being a little smarter and a little wiser, make things better. And that's what we need to walk away from this. How do we be a little bit better? And there's lots of conversations to have here around how we can be a little bit better after this.
So as we finish up, Chris, and I'm going to ask you to tell people where they can find out more about you and your resources. Sure. Yeah. But before we go to that, I would really like for you to leave a lot of people who are probably feeling pretty anxious right now with some practical insight, practical advice for them to walk away with, and maybe shake their head at the TV set and just go, maybe I'll turn that crap off.
Here's the best practical advice. If it sounds too good to be true, it's too good to be true. If it sounds too bad to be true, it's too bad to be true. You have to understand we live in a time where everybody feels like they have to shout as loud as they can to get your attention. And you need to figure out how to disentangle the shout from the content. And that's not all that easy sometimes, but know your source, understand the motivations of your sources, understand that so much of what we see out there is, again, not economic analysis, but political strategizing, political positioning. And you just got to be a more sophisticated consumer of information. It's as simple as that. You cannot take things at face value.
Is there somewhere for the average person who's not an economist, who doesn't understand all those things, to just go, okay, I can go look here, and here's more of reality versus the hyperbolic political?
Yeah. I mean, look, you got The Economist. I always appreciate that publication. And I still think that there's some good stuff done in some of the newspapers where they actually make an effort to write, as opposed to, the 24-hour news networks. No one thinks. They're constantly reacting. It's all 2-paragraph sound bites. You're not going to get any kind of information out of that. You got to read. You got to dig into stuff. You got to look for people who are trying to break things down. We live in a world that's awash with data. I mean, boy, the vast majority of what I use in terms of resources or data just sitting there on these wonderful government websites. People can go out and learn a little bit, become a little bit of an amateur sleuth and dig through these data sets and get to know them a little bit more. We live in the information age. Use it. Don't let somebody else do it for you. Now, admittedly, what does this all mean? It means you might not have as much time for Instagram or Facebook or whatever the poker you're playing online or whatever it happens to be. I appreciate that. But, in the end, we're the only ones who can make us smarter.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Chris. Please tell our listeners, our viewers, where they can find out more about you, all your wonderful resources. And I want to really appreciate you taking the time.
Pleasure. It's beaconecon.com. That's our website for Beacon Economics. Or you can go to the UCR Center for Economic Forecasting and Development. That's at UC Riverside School of Business. Either one of those, you'll find us. We have lots of this stuff online. We try to be the calm voice in the room for better or for worse.
Well, again, Chris, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a pleasure and honor. Hope you'll stay with us to the end. And for you, dear listener, if you want to hang out with other conscious leaders and chat about this episode or any past episodes, as I said, you can go into our Facebook or our LinkedIn groups. You just look for the Leadership and Loyalty podcast. And we, of course, will make sure that we post the links to how you can get a hold of Chris and all of his resources right there too. The fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter how successful you are. If your employees and your customers don't understand what gives your company meaning, you're likely only working at a fraction of your true capability. To find out more about how you can hire me, Dov Baron, as a speaker or a leadership strategist for you or your organization, you can go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. Because unified meaning, or as we call it, finding a dragonfire, is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for all individuals and companies. I want to thank you for sharing this show with everyone you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about the hyperbolic media you're being fed, and just be curious about whether it's too good to be true or it's too bad to be true, as Chris said. I'm Dov Baron, and I'm here to assist you tapping into your dragonfire to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.